Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Evergreen Art Lecture Series, Week 6. We'll warmly welcome Negarra Kudumu in a minute. I just want to remind you all that we have one more art lecture in Week 8 for this quarter, and that will be with Elizabeth Houston, who's a writer who's just published a book, Standard American English. So that will be coming to us on Wednesday, Week 8. And to remind you also that towards the end of we'll have about an hour of hearing from Negarra, and then a half hour of Q&A where we would ask you to raise your hand to ask a question directly. And you can do that with audio, or you can also put it into the Q&A, into the chat. So I would love to welcome student Manny Ibar to introduce our speaker today. Hi, thanks, Manny.
Thank you, Shaw. Good morning, everybody. My name is Manuel Alberto Ibar, but all my friends call me Manny, so please call me Manny, and I now consider us all friends. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to introduce such a wonderful artist. You know, there's a place, a magical place, where healing, spirituality, and art dovetails. This is a place we've all been to. This place is creativity. And creativity is the language of the soul. Our presenter, our guest, is a master in being able to bring healing, art, and creativity as a language to bring us all together. And it is just such a privilege to be able to introduce her today. There are 5 things that I'd like to share with you about our guest, Negarra A. The first thing I'd like to share is that she's an independent scholar, a publisher, a writer, and she's a healer with a focus on the expression of the diaspora experienced by the peoples of Africa, South Asia, and our communities here in the Pacific Northwest. Negarra was educated at Dartmouth College and also at Leiden University in the Netherlands. The second thing that I'd like to share with you about Negarra is that she facilitates the dialogue between the reals as an interlocutrice. And as such, she is part of a wonderful heritage. She is part of the heritage of the masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. She holds the title of Yayi Nkisi Malongo in the Brama Con Brama lineage of the Palo Mayombe. And she is a layperson in the Pimienta lineage of the Lukumi spiritual tradition. She is a practitioner of Muerterismo, Espiritismo Cruzado, Conjure, and she's also a level 2 Reiki practitioner. The third thing I'd like to share with you about Negarra is part of a great tradition of paleros. Paleros are people who are in contact with both the ancestral and natural world, a powerful medium, a bridge, and intermediary. The fourth thing that I'd like to share with you about Negarra is that she's a published author, essayist, and curator with quite the professional background, and her work has appeared internationally in connection with many wonderful art exhibits and curatorial work, including exhibitions and collaborations with the 59th Venice Biennale, the 2022 NETI Award exhibition, the 2021 ARCO Madrid Art Fair, and 3 exhibitions during her tenure at the Center for Contemporary Art in Seattle. Some past professional roles that Negarra has executed have included her work in an international think tank in The Hague and as manager of public programs at the Fry Art Museum, and she is also the owner of Perpetuity Healing Arts. The last thing that I'd like to share with you about Negarra is some of her very own words in an essay about the Sri Lankan artist Rajni Perera, looking at her work, The New Ethnography, Negarra shares with us, as she writes, and I do believe we can also share these very words about Negarra herself. As an artist, Perera is ever growing, always moving, always planning, always making. The narratives we read about her now will not be the narratives written and spoken about her in a few months from now. Why, how, and now we should read this artist? To offer suggestions, I must examine the reasons why I continually come back to Perera's oeuvre. In an area of media celebrity, internet spirituality, fake news, and a litany of various categories of toxic distraction, Perera confronts and interrogates the historical archive, which reminds her and us that where we are now has happened previously. Beautiful words from an artist to an artist. My dear friend, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest lecturer for today, Negarra A.
Thank you so much. I am very, very happy to be here with you this morning. I want to offer my thanks first and foremost to Shaw for this invitation. Shaw and I met several years ago, and I remember we ended up at Mio Posto having this just intensely great conversation about all of the things, art, healing, sort of everything in the middle. And it was, quite frankly, one of the best conversations I had had to date amongst colleagues, acquaintances, friends here in Seattle. And I really remembered that fondly, but then also life was lifing and pandemic happened, but then she reached out to me. And so accepting this invitation was a no-brainer. So Shaw, thank you so much. Manny, I really have to thank you. This is by far the best introduction that I've ever had. I appreciate the thoroughness of your research. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I know that land acknowledgements have become very trendy, and while I still think they're important, it is my hope that those words never fall on deaf ears. My acknowledgement comes from a slightly different place because I am a priestess, as Manny indicated, of Palo Mayombe. My title is Yayi Nkisi Malongo. And it is always important when you are in a place that you are not indigenous to, that you commune with, acknowledge, work with the spirits who are indigenous to that land so that they will open the doors for your works to move in the way that they need to. And so I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this entire region with specific acknowledgement and veneration to the Suquamish and the Duwamish who live in, who were the original inhabitants of the Seattle area. I literally moved within 5 minutes walking distance to the Duwamish River at the top of the pandemic. And so it's unavoidable for me in a variety of ways. That said, I want to go ahead and get started. I want to start actually sort of departing from what Manny shared around creativity, because when I think about my practice and I think about the artists that I work with, what resonates for me when observing their artistic practices is the ways in which there is a resonance around this energy of making, which on the spiritual side of things is sort of the fundamental component. What are you able to make based on your observation of the conditions that you are surrounded by, the ways in which those conditions may or may not be working in your best interest, or even to the extent that they are, you want to leverage that even further. It really always comes down to what are you creating? What can you create? What are the possibilities? And so sort of looking through that lens at artistic practice of the artists that I have come to have close professional and personal relationships with, there has been a lot of intersection and a lot of connectivity, and it's been a point of departure also for camaraderie, because you don't do any of this kind of work, spiritual or artistic, alone. Don't get me wrong. Yes, there are always going to be times when it's just you in your studio, you know, coming up with an idea, testing out ideas. But at a certain point, you are in communication with colleagues, in communication with a variety of energies. And so it's questionable, this notion of aloneness and solitude in this work. And sometimes you just have to experience that in order to sort of understand. It's more of a feeling than it is something that's cognitive in certain instances. And so that has really been the point of intersection for me between art and healing, was this notion of looking at the conditions, making a decision about how those conditions were affecting, not necessarily adversely, but were affecting myself or whomever I may be doing work for, and creating a solution. And where artists are concerned, artists are looking at also at a set of conditions, also often social conditions, often aesthetic conditions, and looking at the ways that they can move those things forward. And in moving those things forward, creation is always the thing that does that. It is both the solution and the catalyst for additional solutions. And sometimes those solutions aren't endpoints. The solutions are questions that open up more possibilities for new creation. So that's really sort of the point of departure for both my curatorial practice, which includes writing, and my spiritual practice. Just sort of a note about my spiritual practice, the spiritual traditions that you heard Manny mention in my introduction, in his introduction about me, are all Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions. Lukumi is an Afro-Cuban spiritual tradition of Yoruba origin. The Yoruba are a ethnic group that is currently concentrated in southwestern Nigeria. Palo Mayombe, also known as Palo Monte, is an Afro-Cuban tradition of Bantu origin. It aggregated and reformulated on Cuban soil, spiritual beliefs from varying Bantu ethnic groups that were brought from their homelands in West Central Africa to Cuba. Palo literally means stick. Monte means the mountains. And so there's one place where Palo Monte literally is the veneration of sticks in the mountain, from the mountain. These are nature-based traditions. And in these nature-based traditions, they are dealing with a variety of entities the majority of whom never incarnated as human. And so these are nature, what we would very loosely kind of call nature spirits. So they can be animals, they can be plants, they can be sort of humanoid, so half human, half animal. But there are a variety of these kinds of entities that we venerate for the purpose that I mentioned earlier around creating and being in conversation with the conditions that we find ourselves in. Specifically where Palo Mayombe is concerned, the conditions that people of African descent that pertain to these Bantu ethnic groups found themselves in upon arrival to Cuba as early as the late 16th century was slavery and colonialism. And so by nature, Palo Mayombe is a liberation cult. And I mention that because it's very important to, when you come into contact with my work, whether I'm talking about the my healing practice or my curatorial practice, you are going to inevitably see that thread, see that reference explicitly or implicitly. I am interested in liberation wholesale in all of the ways that it can come. These past 3 years working in the pandemic have been quite interesting because I've had to revise some of the notions that I have around, these concepts, specifically liberation, because the pandemic has revised everything, right? And so when I speak of liberation, I'm not speaking of this individualized freedom that is enshrined in the values of the United States. I am talking about and the sustained existence of individuals and community who have the choice, the ability to choose what responsibilities they want and to whom they want to be responsible. And that's very different from this individualized notion of freedom. In my writing and in my curatorial practice, while I am not, I'm not necessarily seeking out artists who are working in those themes, but inevitably I am brought to them. And I can only sort of attribute that to sort of the energetic connective tissues that bring me in contact with individuals who are working through the same sort of category of challenges, be they intellectual or otherwise. The definition of liberation that I shared with you is taken directly from a quote by Toni Morrison in the presentation that I just did at this conference called The Loophole of Retreat, which was held in Venice in connection with Simone Lee, who represented the United States as the first Black woman to represent in the United States in the Venice Biennale. I talked a lot about Toni Morrison because I think that she is very key to understanding how we can achieve that in the contemporary, because there's a lot that suggests that even thinking about that is a useless and hopeless endeavor. But again, getting back to artists and what they do, they see a way through that. And their artwork is a first step, a first series of considerations made visible, made tangible in some cases, that can help us consider something else. It is that imagining of other possibilities made real for us. And for me, that's really kind of the power of a spiritual practice that is really lived experience. It's not a trend. It's not, something you do on Tuesdays, but it's the power of a spiritual practice that is lived experience, but it is also the power of an artistic practice that is lived experience. I'm going to shift a little bit and sort of share with you sort of the nuts and bolts of my practice in a very sort of practical manner. I have been involved in African diasporic spiritual practices as a student since 2005. I have been formally involved in these practices as a practitioner since also since 2005. So I've been doing this as both a student and a practitioner at varying levels since for the past going on 18 years. I have only been working in the art world since 2014, believe it or not, and I do not have a background in art history. I am a trained social scientist, and a part of the reason that I was very excited to accept this invitation is because Shaw shared with me that she is co-teaching a course with a critical social psychologist, and social sciences is my background. So this is really kind of right up my alley, because what I have been able to bring to my art writing is a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary perspective that is not exclusively art historical, but that sort of brings together a multitude of disciplines. So I formally started the businesses that are my art and healing practice in 2017. The original iteration of my healing practice was Perpetuity Healing Arts. I changed that and decided to bring the two together because, siloing and in truncation doesn't really make sense, right? It's also a lot. And so intellectually, there was no real separation between art and healing for me in my day-to-day. And also not really in the practice, I went to work every day at the Fry. I came home, I was doing spiritual work for clients. I'm being asked to write an essay about a particular artist, and the artist is asking me to write that essay because they know that I'm a spiritualist and they know that I'm going to include that lens sort of automatically in their work. And so there really was no separation, and still there is not, truly. The conference that I just spoke at in Venice was a conference organized by two artists that intentionally included themes that are not exclusively that are not exclusively to the art, that are not exclusive to the art world. That's what I'm trying to say. So again, there was this enmeshment that worked well for me. And so in 2000, I believe it was 18, I sort of united my practice under the banner of Negarra A, Kudumu, Art and Healing. And from 2019 up until, 2018, 2019, up until last month, it was one entity. And under that entity, I did the same things that I had been doing, a lot of art writing, a lot of curating. Well, a lot more, mostly art writing, less curation. And then the majority of my work was working with clients in individual and group capacities. I recently made the decision for exclusively business and administrative purposes to split the two practices again. Not because I think that they are two separate things, but because I was not articulating well in the online sort of branding space, how those things go together. And I also wanted to give more attention to my curatorial practice, which for a few different reasons, including an award that I won last year, and then this conference in Venice that I just participated in, was sort of growing in terms of visibility. And so now my art practice is one online, my art practice is one thing, and online, my healing practice is another. But in the background, it is still this enmeshment. There's this really beautiful word that my Puerto Rican and Panamanian friends use in Spanish called revolu. And it is really that, it's this revolu. It's always this energy that's always kind of swirling amongst itself, right? And so I'm gonna screen share now so that you all can sort of see what this looks like in real time. So you can put some imagery to the, what I'm talking about. Okay. So this is my newly designed website, negaraAkudumu.com. This website was designed by a very good friend and an incredible artist, Megan Elizabeth Trainer, who, in addition to her art career, is a digital strategist. And I have been working with Megan since 2020. And she just gets it. She gets it. And again, it's that intersection, right? It's that revolu that encompasses, for me, art and healing, art and spirituality. And so, okay, I need to shift some things here. Just give me a minute. There we go. So this is my art website. It is still in progress. This is a picture from the talk that I just gave in Venice. This is a picture from the opening of a gallery that I attended in Paris last year. This is just a very cute picture that a friend took of me. But here you can find a record of my writing, a record of my curatorial endeavors, public speaking that I have done. And it's going to be an archive of my experience, as well as via the news tab, sort of keeping anyone who is interested current on my goings on. Again, it became important to me as of last summer when I won this award that that I needed to give more attention on the internet to what appeared to be a standalone art practice. But as you can see, it's front and center, intersection of art and healing. In my bio, you're going to see that the healing piece is listed here. So this is sort of physically what the branding looks like. And if there's anything that I've learned during this pandemic, is that as professionals in the art world, and especially for artists, that this branding and this visibility piece is important. And it is my hope that for those individuals who are pursuing careers in the art world, whether it be curatorial or as an artist, that you can have the support that you really need on that, and someone that really understands that, because visibility, especially in this internet age, is extremely important, whether we like it or not. And I was someone who did not like it, still has problem with it, but am fortunate to have support in that area. So this is the art profile. This is my healing website. It is going to look slightly different by January, but fundamentally, this is my healing website. What you see here, this logo, this background logo, is a piece that was designed by Sean Cardinal, who originally was living in Seattle, but has relocated to the East Coast, an amazing artist. And again, he understood the concept that I want. The vulture and the leopard jaguar are animal totems that are extremely important to me, that show up in different ways in my practice, quite sort of front and center. And so I wanted that on my website. This circle here that you see sort of surrounding the center vulture is a nod to what we call in Palo Kikongo a patipemba, but it's also referred to as a dikenga. And it is a very basic visual understanding, visual rendering of the Bakongo understanding of the universe. And so I wanted that on there to be a direct nod to this spiritual tradition that is heavily Bantu Congo, although not exclusively, and to really have that be sort of my point of departure for both my art and healing practice, because this website initially was the place where the art and the healing live. Now it is just the healing. And so as you go through this, you'll see the services that I offer: coaching, hypnotherapy, teaching, as well as products that I make that of a spiritual esoteric nature. One aspect of my practice that is very important, and sort of it's getting back to this community piece, is this community that I've built called the Communiversity. Again, my notions around community are ever growing and shifting, and this is an important part of my practice, both in art and healing, because sustainable generative growth, actual mutual aid happens in community. It does not happen individually. And so when we are really talking about trying to deal with some of these tougher questions, thinking about healing, thinking about decolonial practice, those are not things that are accomplished by themselves, by yourself. These are accomplished by individuals coming together around shared values, and who are able to have generative discourse around the directions that they want to go, around the way in which they want their community to be built, and their expectations around support, understanding what they mean, what is meant when they say mutual aid. And so the Communiversity is an aspect of my healing practice, where I have, since November 2020, created an intentional online community to bring people together who were interested in learning and continuing discussion around African-rooted spiritual traditions and art from the various regions, sort of departing from the various regions that I have interest in. It has always slanted heavy on the healing piece. That's what people really want and need. I'm doing sort of my best to sort of increase the level of discourse around the art, because obviously that's a big part of my life and a big part of my practice. But again, this started just as something I thought, okay, let me see and try if this can, and see if this can work. It has really turned into a tightly knit, functioning community that is interested in ongoing learning, that is truly interested in healing in community, and wants to have a, not just a safe space, but a dynamic space where they can think out loud about some of these ideas, get the kind of reciprocal support that they need, that they also want to give. And so this is increasingly an important part of my practice, because it's just sorely needed. And, you know, when I, in my divination sessions with my own spiritual entities, sort of check in and see, you know, what the general consensus is, especially now as we are going into what is most certainly, even if they're not saying it now, will eventually be a recession. Community is the only way. We're not going to get through these times by ourselves. Community is where it's at, and most importantly, we need to be active in fomenting healthy community. In my art practice, I am associated with a group of individuals based here in Seattle, who go by the name of Black Constellation. The majority of them are based here in Seattle. Another member is in Alaska, another member is in Toronto, and another member is sort of between Atlanta and Seattle. But the majority are from Seattle. Oh, and another one is in Los Angeles, but the majority are either in or from Seattle. And this is an extremely prolific, multidisciplinary arts collective that includes musicians and fine artists and music writers and journalists as well. And so this notion of community where my art practice is concerned really sort of started to bear out in my association with the Black Constellation as early as 2014, sort of about 8 months after I had arrived in Seattle. Summer 2014, there were two really amazing exhibitions, one of which was Your Feast Has Ended, and then the other one was the Unicorn Incorporated. The Your Feast Has Ended featured Mekoyo Ali Barnes, who is a Seattle native, Nep Sidhu, who's based in Toronto, and Nicholas Galanin, who is based in Sitka. The Unicorn Incorporated feature in a now deceased artist by the name of Curtis R. Barnes, who is the father of Mekoyo Ali Barnes. And these exhibitions were incredibly rich, incredibly raw and honest in throughout, but also incredibly lush aesthetically. And I was invited to give a talk in August of 2014 as a part of the programming for these exhibitions. The three individuals in Your Feast Have Ended are three of the members of the Black Constellation. And that was my first sort of formal interaction with the Black Constellation in that way. And since then, I have had the privilege, because I am friends with several of the individuals in the collective, to sort of observe them at varying ranges. And this is for me where I have seen the ways in which community can work at its best. It's not about perfect, it's about sustainable. And I'm going to say that again because I think it's very, very important. It's not about perfect, it's about sustainable. The goal is to set up something that's going to have longevity for all of the individuals and their legacy, the generations that come after them. That's the point. And so in looking at them as an artistic community, as an artistic collective, and then thinking about how prolific they are individually, but also collectively, it really made me think about the possibilities, the generative possibilities that can come from intentional community building, both in the arts and in healing. For me, in healing, it was very clear because Palo Mayombe in particular, as a liberation cult, has always been deeply ingrained in Maroon culture. Maroons were free Black people who formed colonies throughout the diaspora of the Americas, including the United States, despite the way in which that history is intentionally trying to be erased. And these were free Black people. These were societies of free Black people. Some of the most famous ones in the diaspora are the Maroons of Jamaica, led by a woman referred to as Queen Nanny. Another one was what they call Quilombo in Brazil, the origins of which are connected to Zumbi dos Palmares in northeastern Brazil. But you have them throughout the African diaspora of the Americas, including the United States. And those societies were built to be safe spaces for Black people who had took their freedom, who escaped slavery, and for them to be able to live in community and support each other in remaining free. And so the model there for me has always been clear, but as a new member of the art world, and especially being in Seattle, which is on the margins of the art world in the United States, it was a new thing for me. And so being able to witness their work in exhibitions, in musical performances, and being able to write quite a bit about their work. I've written about Nicholas's work, I've written about Nep's work, I've written about Mekoyo's work. I recently contributed to the KEXP podcast on the Black Constellation, which I highly recommend you check out if you have not already listened to it. And really being able to watch in real time, at varying degrees of proximity, that community in action has been a huge inspiration. But more importantly, to the point that I was making earlier about creative possibilities, it has shown me in real time what creative possibilities can look like. And so that was an inspiration for building this community on Patreon. I intentionally, I tried to be very intentional about the pricing. I've recently opened up a new tier, which is a $5 tier, because I am acutely aware of the economic challenges that many people are having, and do not want anyone to feel as if they cannot participate because they don't have the money. And so that was the starting point in November, and I'm now, as you can see, at 92 patrons. My patrons continue to be very generous with me and very, very consistent since November 2020. And we are moving things forward. I recently added a Discord server to the community because I wanted to deepen I wanted to deepen the engagement. And so that is another benefit of joining the communiversity and just digging deeper into additional ways to deepen the engagement. That's what I'm trying to say. So I want to go back to some of the sort of guiding points that Shaw shared with me in her initial invitation. So thinking about self-care in particular and decolonial healing. I'm going to start with self-care because that is something that really came up a lot during the pandemic in light of everyone being at home, right? And sort of this on the internet in particular, and you're going to hear me say a lot that says like on the internet, because I want to distinguish that from real life, because however much time we spend on the internet, specifically social media, that is not, in my opinion, that is not lived experience in the same way that person to person experience is. It is very much so the paranormal. And I am acutely aware that there are entire generations of people for whom the internet has been the standard. But there are many generations for whom the internet was not always the standard. And there are some experiences that can never happen on the internet, can never happen and be generative, I should say, on the internet. And so I want to make that distinction as carefully as possible. And so self-care has been a buzzword. I think we see it, hashtag self-care. And I really got to thinking about it, and I really got to sort of also problematizing it, because self-care, again, comes back to the individual. And I do not want to diminish in any way the work that we as individuals have to do for ourselves. But it is very, I think, dangerous to take on this notion of I all the time. Yes, you are responsible for paying your bills. You are responsible for finding a therapist if you need one. You are responsible for all of those kinds of things. But being responsible for all of those kinds of things quickly becomes a burden if you do not have anyone or any group of people, no matter how small, with whom you can share that lived experience and really work through how you feel about it, how it affects you. And so with the pandemic, when we were all at home and all spending too much time on the internet, self-care became even, more of a thing. This was also at a time where a lot of artists were no longer able to be in their studios, were not able to show, plans were being canceled and postponed. And so it was all happening. It was this whole like sort of cabal of isolation. And I have to say, I'm far more leery of discussions around self-care now than even I was pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, because I don't see it as sustainable. When we think about artists and art making, yes, again, you ultimately are responsible for finishing that body of work. But the whole point of doing that is so that it can go into the public domain so people can see it. So ideally, if possible, you can have an exhibition of some kind. It can be collected. But the idea, the point is almost always engagement. And that requires people, that requires community, And so I can't think about self-care without thinking about how that is really sort of antithetical to sort of what humans normally do. It's extremely isolationist, and it allows for very myopic thinking. It may feel good in the moment. I'm not saying don't go have a spa day if that's what you want to do. I'm not going to say don't indulge in a nice lunch for yourself if that's what you want to do. Sometimes you do need that, but if the pandemic has taught us anything, the ways in which isolation has manifested during these 3 years has really and truly been detrimental. And I don't think we need to bring anything else into our life that is intentionally detrimental. And certainly, given the generative nature of artistic practice, and the way that it is always moving towards community, isolation doesn't happen. Like, even in some of the most exclusive spaces that exist in the art world, the point is that you want and need people there to see it, to be interested in it, to talk about it, to write about it, to buy it. That requires a variety of different kinds of communities. And so I'm increasingly suspicious of self-care, self-help, and I think perhaps we need to be more specific when we're talking about that. Decolonial is very interesting, especially in the art world, because the vast majority of the museums, well, let me rephrase that. Some of the most well-known museums in the world, particularly in the United States and Europe, especially those that have collections that are categorized under the title antiquities, are institutions that were built during the colonial period and whose antiquities collections were stolen from places where Europeans in particular, though not exclusively, implemented colonialism and slavery. And so it's always been interesting to me, the notion of both the post-colonial and the decolonial, because the very institutions we need to look at are institutions that would not be in existence if it were not for colonialism. So that's the first thing that I want us to think about and that I want to say about that. There is an argument to be made that the times that we are living in are not post-colonial. Now, does the institution of colonialism still exist as we are referring to it, as we understand it via various readings of the historical archive as it existed in the 20th, sorry, not the 20th century, the 20th century, sorry. As it existed in the early portions of the 20th century and the latter portions of the 19th century? No, of course not. But we're still dealing with the legacies of colonialism, many of which, maybe not most, many of which we have not gotten rid of. A very close and uncomfortable example for the United States of America is the situation in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico gained its independence from Spain and almost immediately became a colony of the United States. Nobody wants to call it that, but that's essentially what has been the case. That's how Puerto Ricans, both on the island and in the various places where they live, that's what many of them think and how they have experienced it. United States tried that in Cuba, it didn't quite work. Various European countries still have colonies in various places. The French refer to them as the overseas territory, the Outre-mer. The Dutch have their Antilles, you know, it's still a thing. And so colonialism really truly is not quite gone. And I'm not suggesting that it needs to be gone in order for us to begin to decolonize, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that it's not gone. And I don't know that that's a conversation that's happening. And when I say I don't know that that's a conversation that's happening, I'm not being snarky or tongue in cheek. I'm really kind of viewing this from the outside in, because that's not a discourse that I am involved in. The other thing that I think needs to be centered in decolonial practice, especially in the United States, in North America in particular, is a centering of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous struggles, movements, I should say, for sovereignty that have been going on for quite some time, long before decolonial praxis was a buzzword. And in my estimation, that's not quite centered enough. It's interesting. I took part in a race and social justice cohort for cultural organizations led by the Race and Social Justice Division, I guess, of the city of Seattle. And it was stated by the facilitator of that group that the narrative, that the discourse around social justice, race and social justice, centered on the African-American experience. Now, as an African-American person, I think that is important. Absolutely. African-Americans who are the descendants of Africans who were brought here and enslaved. That is important. But in looking at the history, we too are visitors. We're not settlers. We are visitors here, and we weren't brought here. We did not choose to come here. It's important. Again, this is why we have to go back and look at history. We did not choose to come here. We were brought here forcibly to a place that already had inhabitants, that already had its civilizations. And we were forced into a situation where our labor was used to create this country. And quite frankly, if we're being honest, contributed to the colonialist ability to successfully push out the indigenous populations. That doesn't mean that we're any less oppressed. It just means that our experience is different, and we need to acknowledge the ways in which our experience has intermixed, overlapped with that of indigenous people. But also as visitors, I think we need to acknowledge that we need to acknowledge and do more than just acknowledge, center the indigenous experience and their contemporary realities, because we are on their land. And again, spiritually, for me, I have a protocol for that. My question is, what is the protocol in the rest of the world? And specifically for museums that were born out of this colonial era, who would not have the bulk of their collections if it was not for colonialism. What does decolonial practice really mean? Because if we're looking at what that prefix D means, it means undoing. I've yet to hear about any of these colonial museums undoing anything. Now, I will acknowledge that the restitution movement is moving forward. And I have been very happy to see that there are museums that are attempting and actually sending pieces from their collections back to their countries of origin. That's important. It's insufficient, though. It's just insufficient. Because again, when we look at the meaning of words, decolonial, D as in a prefix that talks about undoing. Restitution is not an undoing. It may be a first step, but restitution is not an undoing. I think we have to grapple with the realities that, and this is now I'm speaking as a paleta. I think we have to grapple with the reality that the violence of colonialism that allowed for the creation of these things may be a different kind of violence may be required to undo these things. Now, that statement may land in a very difficult way for many people. I consider myself a nonviolent person. I do not like to engage in acts of violence. My life has thankfully been one that is primarily not violent, especially not physically violent. But we have to admit that much of history has been mired in violence. And as a result of violence, there have been things that have been created that continue a kind of intellectual and psychological and spiritual violence that is committed every day against other people that these institutions at least continue want to think about as subjects. And I don't know that anything other than violence is going to be able to undo that. I want to be proved wrong. I want to be proved wrong. But when I look around me, when I look in the world, which I have to do as a spiritualist, which I ought to be doing on a regular basis as a curator, when I look in the world, what I see is violence. A hell of a lot of it, all the time. All the time. And so I'm offering these things not so we can come to a conclusion, but so that we can start to think about really and truly what we're dealing with. And I think the biggest thing that I offer as a spiritualist and a curator is to help people see what it is that we're actually dealing with here, to help people open their eyes and broaden their minds. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. Let's get into this thing from stem to stern. And again, getting back to sort of this notion of creating, you can begin to create once you have investigated. Once you have investigated, you can begin to envision and imagine what this solution might be, or what this thing might be that could foment an eventual solution. And that for me is sort of that's where I live at. I live at that intersection, because that is what I want to do in my art writing. That is what I want to do in my curation. That's sort of what I'm always aiming for in my art writing and my curation, but that's also what I'm always doing in my spiritual practice. The end product is different. In the art world, the end product gets to be seen, gets to be read. In the spiritual world, it may or may not be observable. Oftentimes people don't necessarily know what they're looking at, but nonetheless, it is a result, and that result is really and truly changed conditions. Really and truly, it's changed conditions. It's that feeling you get when you see a show, and when you see the show, whether you loved it or hated it, you are so verklempt, up in arms, wrapped, that you just don't know what to do with yourself. It's that feeling. Conditions have been changed when you feel like that about a thing. So we're at the hour mark. I don't want to talk too long because I can talk a lot, but I'm happy to take questions if anyone has them. I'd love to hear from you guys.
Thank you. It's been amazing. I would give them a second. You all can raise your hands, or you can get on the Q&A and here, hi, and get on the Q&A and contribute to the conversation. So we'll give them some time. I'm struck with this idea of conditions. I think about conditions a lot, like the even being conditioned by like geography, weather, where we are, and then of course like historical. It's everything that sort of pushes us. It's both the structural and it's the personal. And I'm interested in how you keep circling around this idea of conditions, and then two things coming out of the conditions, like the fomenting of community and the fomenting of solutions. This idea that there is some, whatever solutions are, not that they're an end product, but they are actually maybe a set of questions that both the healing and the art practice can do. Is to that's really where the solution lies, right? It's that investigation to then know what questions to ask. Mm-hmm. We have.
I see a question here from Claire. Do you think the violence that is happening now is in part of what the false information through the internet and politics in general? So I think it's a whole cabal, Claire. And so I think there is violence that is happening in communities because of desperation, and desperation caused by poverty, and all the things that go along with poverty. I think there is violence at a political level because the ruling class is seeing that their whole situation is falling apart, and there's kind of this like mad grab to retain power, and you do that most effectively through just wanton violence. And when I say effectively, I don't mean that it's a good decision. It's not a value judgment. It literally means that it's effective. It does what it needs to do, which is scare people and make people not want to rebel. I do think that false information, a lot of smoke and mirrors, is contributing to is sort of stirring the pot, but it's not the only thing. It's sort of a cabal. And it can be difficult to know what you're looking at. And the internet in particular convinces us that everything needs to be fast. But in order to really know what you're looking at, you've got to slow down and really observe it. And it's interesting, my artist friends always, ask me, well, Negarra, what did you think of that show? And I'm just like, well, I'm seeing this show and I'm thinking about an exhibition you did 6 years ago, and thinking about the trajectory. And so really to understand these things, you need to be willing to look at history and then actually go look at it. Because some of this is just historical cycle. Other of it, though, is new stuff that is surging up. But absolutely, I do think false news is one of several factors involved in this. And I think a big factor is just the fact that this, Western society as we know it the foundation is crumbling. It's like, I don't know if any of you all are into tarot, but there is a card called the Tower. It's one of the major arcana cards. And, it is like a doomscape. The tower is crumbling, there's fire, people are like flying out the top of the window. It's a whole thing. And what the tower tells you is like, yes, it's a hot mess now. And until this thing literally falls apart, it's going to be a hot mess. But it also asks you, what are you going to build afterwards? It's not easy by any manner of means, but that is the question. And it's a rather, in some ways, it's a ironically simple question. Okay, next question. How do you protect your creativity and spirituality from Western appropriation? On a personal level, on a community level, I'm able to do that because there are certain aspects of my spiritual tradition that happen in private. My tradition is an initiatory tradition. So if you are not initiated and you are not a part of my lineage, there is no participation in that way. However, in the public side of my practice, I do work with members of the community of all walks of life, of all, tones and tenors. But I personally am a very private person, and I am also very confidential with the information that individuals share with me when they come to me. My tradition is initiatory, so there's certain pacts and agreements that I swore when I got initiated, and I stick to those. In that way, I am very orthodox. I swore a certain thing, and I'm not going to violate that for anything or for anyone. So in some ways, on the spiritual side, it is I would say easier. I would also say this tradition is a tradition that was born within a set of social conditions that were oppressive. And appropriation is nothing but, a more common contemporary form of oppression. And so it's designed to live below the radar within this kind of society. So much so that if you go and do a Google search on Palo Monte and Palo Mayombe, you will come up with information. The majority of it is wrong. That which is not wrong is so specific to the lineage that the writer engaged with that is not universally applicable. And part of the reason that is wrong is because practitioners have historically been so guarded about their tradition that when someone comes asking their question, they'll either refuse to answer it, leaving the writer to speculate, or they'll just lie. It's a secret society. We are probably the most public now that we've been, but there's some things that we're just not going to tell. We are not a universal tradition. We don't claim to be or desire to be universal. We do, however, help who we need to help who comes to us really in need. There's a lot of what I do in my practice that I don't talk about, but I help a lot of people for extremely discounted prices or free, because that's the time we live in. People need help. And how am I calling myself a priestess in the liberation cult if I'm not helping somebody who needs help? Now, creativity, specifically art practice, that's where it gets interesting, because you don't have a art world really and truly without all of these colonial processes. And the art world, particularly from a commercial standpoint, is one of the, in my estimation, other people may disagree with me, but is one of the last places where unbridled capitalism can just thrive. It's really wild out there. And so I think protecting one's creativity starts with whatever your personal ethic is. If that's your ethic from the beginning, I think that's sort of, that's how you do that. Oh, Kathleen, thank you so much for your comment. I appreciate it. Mariah, Madison.
I think Erica had a hand up and then Madison, but Erica, do you want to come back? I saw your hand go up and then come back down. Do you want to ask a question?
That was actually my question that you just addressed.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay,
thank you.
okay.
Beautiful. That was wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much.
No problem. I want to try to get as many of these as possible, so I'll try to go a little quickly. From Mariah, what can an individual do to generate resources where a culture is suffering from substance abuse and homelessness? Yes, that is a very, very big question, and that is front and center here in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Seattle. Generating resources is a must. I have not always been in the scenario that I am in now, where I've been able to successfully work for myself and earn a living. There were times I have often been severely underpaid. There have been times where I've been unable to find work. This is where community becomes important, because so many individuals, before they are able to get on their feet, if they're ever able to get on their feet, are able to experience, are able to achieve some level of sustenance through the communities that they are engaged in. This is, for me, is where I want to really start thinking more deeply about mutual aid and what that looks like. And so I don't know so much that I have an answer to the what, so much as I have a suggestion to align with community and be willing to have conversations about that are ingrained in reciprocity and mutual aid. One very small example that I can give you is I was paying a shit ton of money to a lawn service during the pandemic. Their customer service was trash, and I was just like, I can't be bothered with this anymore. I discovered TaskRabbit, and I found a young man who, for a very, very cheap rate, came, cut my entire backyard, weeded everything. And so I hired him through TaskRabbit, and he said to me, you know what, I really appreciate you hiring me. I have not had work in a very long time. I am happy to work with you outside of TaskRabbit because they're going to charge you a fee. They're going to charge you more. So in that small exchange, he was showing his gratitude for me having hired him, but also was putting me on to the fact that he would be willing to continue to work with me because that would save me money. And so what I decided from there is that I was just going to hire him direct. Why? He does good work. He is interested in working. And that benefits me. And the money that I pay him, and I ended up paying him a rate that was higher than what was on the app. The money, I know that the money that I'm paying him is going to be put to his sustenance. However he chooses to use it is not my business. But I know that that is going to a good, going in the right direction. That is, for me, a base level example of mutual aid. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out and start and do lawn service in particular, but what I'm trying to exemplify here is the way in which you can establish in your interactions with people what need you can meet and how they can show and express their reciprocity in response to you meeting that need. That can be the beginning of work for a person, steady money for a person. And I think we don't think about it in that way. That's very much a base level, lowest common denominator, but this is how a lot of people need to live. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this during this recession. And so my advice right now would be to tap into the communities that you're a part of and think about what you're really and truly willing and able to offer. If you are in a particularly difficult situation, I would say take advantage of all of the social services that are available at the state and the city level so that you can make sure that you're eating and you have transit and rental support if that service still exists. All right, let me speed through. Okay, so Madison, I am going to invite you to contact me personally about that, because that is a very long response and we don't have time for that. But Madison's question, I'll just share it with everyone, is can I tell you about my practice as a priest and what I do specifically? That would easily be another 30 minutes. And so I am gonna have you get my email address from Shaw so we can take up that conversation.
We have time for just a quick one. We have to end at
Right.
12:55 because there is another event that I just
Right.
yeah. So thank
So
you.
the last two questions are both about violence. What forms of unconventional violence can be derived from our artistic and spiritual lives? And then how do we go about changing I'm sorry, Donna is asking about fixing what is wrong rather than putting more money into defense. I mean, both of what you all are talking about is paradigm change at the individual and community level, but also paradigm change at the broader American societal political system level. I believe in people's right to manifest, not manifest in the woo-woo sense as you see on spiritual internet, but manifest as in protest for the things that they believe in. I think that there are times in where protest can seem a bit sort of watered down, but I think there are times where protest is can work. I think that's one thing. What I really believe in, particularly in terms of the American political system, speaking to Donna's question, is we need to get lobbyists with progressive thinking in Washington.
I might have to quickly interrupt. And can I just say, The people that are supporting us have another event. There are 3 events, and for you all students, go to Inside Evergreen to find out the career panels in sciences and social sciences. And I just want to thank you, Negarra. You've spoken to so many of us in different programs, doing different kinds of investigation, and it has just been really, really invigorating. And I've just so appreciated it. And I would say, just to follow up on the thing I just interrupted you on, sadly, is that on the 8th is we vote. So vote, because locally it happens. So make sure you're voting. So thank you.
No problem. I just put in the chat all of my web and social media. So please follow me there. Please get my email from Shaw. I'd love to stay in touch. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Negarra.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye.